At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 28th, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. You are the reason that I can keep recording these fascinating interviews week after week and get them up on air for anybody who wants to listen to download 100% for free. Basically, our funding model at this point, because of how seldom and how dried up the sort of ad sales world is almost fully on Patreon. You will notice that there are programmatic ads at the beginning of the show and maybe once or twice throughout the show, depending on its length. That is a model that almost all podcasters sort of have to use at this point in order to have our hosting. But those programmatic ads are very, very different than host-read ads. Pulling back the curtain a little bit here, they don't contribute financially nearly to the extent of host-read ads, and those have just really dried up a lot. So always open to advertising or to partnerships if that's something that you're interested in, especially if it goes hand in hand with the science and social justice topics that we often talk about on the show, especially if it highlights women or gender minorities or people of color or just folks who usually or historically have not been empowered to have their stories told. But that said, really Patreon is the way that we're keeping this going. It's how I pay my producer, Noelle. It's how I pay my editors. And yeah, it's how I've been doing this now for 11 years. We are on episode 500. What episode? 561 right now. And so I do want to thank those of you who have contributed on a weekly basis. They include Anu Bhadavaj, Chuck Blell, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Joseph Lamore, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, and many, many, many more. Those are just the top patrons, but so many of you have contributed over the years, and I'm just really, really, really grateful. Okay, so let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Starre Vartan. She is a science writer, and she has contributed to a lot of different outlets that you've probably read, including Scientific American, National Geographic, and also news outlets like CNN, Washington Post, Slate, and New York Magazine, among many, many more. And she has a new book out. It's called The Stronger Sex: What Science Tells Us About the Power of the Female Body. So without any further ado, here she is, Starre Vartan. Well, Starre, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we're going to be talking about your newest book, The Stronger Sex: What Science Tells Us About the Power of the Female Body. But before we even dive into that, I want to know a little bit more about you. I'm reading here that you split your time between the PNW, the Pacific Northwest, and Sydney, Australia. But you mentioned also that you're a New Yorker. Where are you right now that we're, communicating?
Right now, I'm on an island in the Pacific Northwest, right across Puget Sound from Seattle.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, so we're on the same time zone. I'm down here in LA. So the sun is setting a little later for you, but otherwise it is the same time of day. Sometimes when I'm recording with folks who are like in Australia, we have to get really creative with our timing. One of us isn't asleep.
I do a lot of that because I am doing a lot of writing and reporting from Australia. So I was born there in Sydney and lived there till I was about 4. And then I went back and forth a lot in my childhood, but mostly grew up in New York's Hudson Valley and then came out here to the Pacific Northwest with my partner a few years ago. So it's a lot easier of a flight from here, I will say. Going back and forth from Australia to New York pretty much sucks. From the West Coast, it's like a breeze comparatively,
Yeah, it's a long flight, but at least you can get a direct flight from the West Coast, which is nice.
Exactly. So I'm loving that aspect of being a little closer to my Australian family, and at least in my mind, other people are like that's still a real huge flight. To me, it's a lot easier.
For sure. And so I'm curious, you are a science writer. How long have you, like, has that always been your sort of career ambition? Did you go to J school for it? Were you kind of into science first and then you found writing? I always find with science communicators that there are so many different paths that people take.
There are. I actually probably knew that this was my path when I was very young. I actually have a piece of paper that I wrote on when I was 8 that said, when I grow up, I want to be a scientist. And when I grow up more, I want to be a writer. And that's kind of exactly what happened. I did go to college. I was pre med for actually most of college. And then I switched to geology because I really loved being outside and still do. And I realized I didn't want to be a doctor. And then I realized I didn't want to work in a lab. And I thought geology was super fascinating and I loved the environmental aspects of it. So I sort of switched majors late in my career and then in my college career. And then I started my working career as a geologist. And I was actually an environmental geologist for an independent company in Connecticut. And I then realized, per my early childhood remembrances, that I really wanted to be a writer. And that was really important to me. I'd actually double majored in English in college just for fun so that I could read plenty of novels and take Shakespeare classes. And actually, that was a really big clue to what I wanted to do with my life. So I combined both of those and started writing actually a lot of and environmental science articles early in my career. Then sort of took a dog leg when blogging became a really important and exciting thing in the early 2000s. My good friend at just a job I was working was a webmaster, and he built me a website. And I was one of the first environmental science slash green lifestyle bloggers, specifically talking to women. There was a lot of sort of peak oil and sort of doom and gloom environment stuff going on. And I'd been doing side hustle freelance writing on top of my regular full-time job covering some environmental topics there. And I had all this great information that started coming across my desk. And I was like, hey, I have enough here to write my own blog. So I did it. And so that was actually started blogging on my friend's site in 2002. And then I started my own site in 2005. So this was very early days.
Oh, yeah.
And I was on, Twitter really early. And, I saw the whole rise and fall of all of that. It was a lot of fun. I had an absolute blast. I was in New York City for most of that. And I went to a ton of great events and saw great, wonderful, incredible, innovative things and terrible greenwashing things and, all the stuff in between. And then sort of realized that I missed the harder science. As fun as all of those parties and sort of adventures were, I did some travel writing around the subject as well. I veered back towards science. And so I went to Columbia for an MFA in nonfiction writing because I'd been really a science person in my formal training. And I'd been doing a lot of writing and I wanted more practice and style and form and just the ability to sort of luxuriate in writing for a couple years. And I decided right at the same time, actually, I was 29, that I didn't want to have kids. I was like, I think the child-free life is for me. Again, very early. It was a little bit before this became a big talking point. And so I really felt like I had the financial and time freedom at that age to sort of go in this direction, and picked up more hardcore science writing, combining that with my writing training with the MFA. So, I mean, I feel like that was a really great decision at that point in my life. I was a little bit older than most of the other people in the grad program, which also is always helpful because I was really there to do the work. And then ever since then, I've been a full-time freelance science writer. I have covered a lot of environment and animal stories, and then I've gotten back into my first love, and I will say my family's sort of background. I have a lot of medical people in my family, doctors, and my grandmother who raised me was an EMT. and sort of got back into the bodies and the physiology of it all. And so I actually have been reminded about why I love that subject. And of course, these days, this all combines. Our bodies are, very affected by the environment, and we're learning about those connections more and more every day. And so, this book isn't really about that subject, but that is one that I've covered quite a bit.
Right. I've got to ask you, this is like a little bit inside baseball for anybody eavesdropping on our conversation that is listening to the podcast. But it seems like we probably know a lot of the same people, but it seems like we had some not similar career paths, but career paths that may have been in parallel around similar timeframes. Did you ever go to the Science Online, like unconferences?
No, that doesn't
You were
sound
never at
familiar.
SIO. Okay, that's so
Uh-uh.
interesting. I feel like probably ask around your like journo and science writer friends, and we will find our 1 degree of Kevin Bacon there at Science Online. Anyway, this is all to say that you have kind of meandered, especially within sort of biomedical or medical sciences and environmental sciences, and really put your own kind of stamp and flavor on the freelance writing work that you've done. A lot of people who work in freelance writing, they either have a beat or they have like a style that they like to choose. But have you found that you're mostly all over the place? Do you tend to do like long form, like big feature pieces? Do you like to do kind of quick pieces? And how did the book, or the books, I should say, work themselves into your approach to writing? Because that's a totally different beast, isn't it?
Yeah, I definitely am a long-term projecty person. I like to sink my teeth into something. And I will say that a challenge, especially when you're starting out as a freelance writer, I think in any beat, but science for sure as well, because there's a lot of incredibly talented and accomplished people that do this work. It is harder to write longer form just to get those commissions. If you're sort of independently financed or something, you can afford to spend several months on a story or do it part time. That's really wonderful. But I had to do a lot of short hit stories. And those are great because you get to talk to such a wide variety of experts. And my favorite part of this job, besides the actual writing, I am a writer who loves to write, but my other favorite part is speaking with these incredible scientists. And so, when you're doing those short hit, those 800 to 1200 word pieces, which are sort of the most commonly assigned ones, you get to speak to 2 or 3 fantastic experts and ask them all sorts of nerdy, interesting, fun questions. And so, it's enjoyable, but you don't get the aspect of really sinking your teeth into a single subject. So I definitely was missing that and was looking around for that. But as they always say, when you're thinking of book ideas, you really need to focus on the the fact that this idea could be a book and isn't just going to be a long narrative article that you could pitch for, 5 or 8,000 words or something like that. What makes your idea a book and not an article? And so I really, when I, brought an idea forward, I really wanted to make sure that I had a book. And I wrote a feature article in 2019 for Medium. At that point, they were independently funded and were doing some really amazing longer form articles and paying very well too. So which, helps because it gives the writer the space and the time to really put the energy into a longer article. Long story short, I got an incredible response from the article, which I wasn't really expecting. And that's kind of what they always say to keep an eye out for when you're a freelance writer. So the article was basically a short version of this book. It was the, various different types of strengths that female bodies have. And I'd sort of been collecting this information over time, kind of like when I first started my blog back in the early 2000s. There was just I'm a little bit of a magpie, and I like to gather information and I put it in different folders and tabs in my web browser. And So I had been writing my usual beat, a lot of stuff on Pacific Northwest animals. I was writing for bigger publications, Scientific American and Nat Geo, getting some assignments on some biomedical topics. And I was like coming across journal pieces and articles in for sports medicine, and just here and there as I'm, flying around the internet doing research for other stuff, that were really solid arguments and new science around different aspects of the female body's strength. And these ranged from immunity to metabolism to different kinds of muscular tests that people were doing, and also just reading some of the really interesting science behind how the female body came to be understood as it is now, so science history. And so there's some really amazing authors that have done tremendous work on that in recent years. Shout out to Rachel Gross's Vagina Obscura, which has, it's like about half history of just how we got to where we are with understanding bodies and female bodies in particular in science, and even my own perceptions as a person who was trained in these various science, has been writing science all of this time, where I might be seeing things in a certain way because of cultural stories I was told and not necessarily, backed up by science. So putting that all together, I realized, and getting this wonderful response from just covering like sort of 4 ways that, the female body is strong for medium in a longer format piece. And then how much I had to leave out and how much more there was out there made me realize I have a book. There's a full book. There's so much here. And indeed, I ended up having 140,000 words that I wrote. And so I had to cut out about 40,000 of those words.
Wow.
So I was correct in my understanding in 2019 that there was indeed a book here and there was plenty of material for it.
And speaking of that material, I mean, you kind of touched on this, but I'd love to dig a little bit deeper. Obviously, the content, the topic here, the main sort of question and thesis is interesting. It's fundamentally interesting. It matters. It feels personal. But if you can even put into words, like what really did sort of inspire you to even start writing about the female body to begin with? Was there something was there an experience? Was there something you came across once that like really, a thread that you felt like you needed to start to pull? Or is it something that you've sort of always been thinking about, like gender roles and the way that we are sort of, the way that society sort of constrains us, and you just wanted to kind of dig a little deeper?
It really goes to my own experience as a little girl. It is a very embodied experience. And I will say, I am an intellectual person and very sort of science focused, but the energy and the passion for this project really came from my own experiences and my body itself. And by that, I mean that when I was a little girl, I grew up with my grandmother, which I detail in my book, and we had a property in the Hudson Valley. And it was just me and her. And she was like, great, I have this like very young, energetic kid. I'm going to assign her chores. And she was also just a big believer in doing work, like physical work was important, from how she had grown up. And she'd grown up in New York City, so she really felt like being outdoors and being outside was important. And so I had a running list of chores, and some of those chores were physically difficult. I was hauling wood. When I was very little, of course, she was helping me and showing me how to do things. But, by the time I was 7 or 8 years old, I was doing things like hauling a wheelbarrow full of wood. And as kids do, I wanted to finish up and get inside so I could, watch a TV show or go run around in the woods and play in my forts or go read a book. Those were basically my 3 favorite activities. I would overload the wheelbarrow and I would, test myself. How heavy can I make this so I can do fewer wheelbarrow trips, or carry more things, from the car to the house than, so I could get it done faster, right? That's what kids do. But in that, and also in a lot of my woods adventures, running and jumping over things and all of that, I really learned my body's limits and capacities at a young age. And I was constantly testing them as I grew. And so I had a really strong understanding of what I was able and capable of doing. And then, and my grandmother never sort of put any brakes on me. She was never like, "Oh, you should be careful of this," or, she
Okay.
was just very like, you can figure it out, and I trust you. You're capable, right? And so she was, interestingly, she was an EMT. So you think, oh, maybe she would be more paranoid about kids getting hurt. But I think on the other hand, she was also like, well, I can fix up whatever may happen. And not very much ever did actually happen. The worst thing I went through was I fell off my bike and cracked my knee open, but that wasn't even doing my chores, right? The end of that story is that I basically went to school and heard and felt a very different message. So I would go
Right.
to school and summer camp, and they would say, "Here, a boy should help you. Get a man to help you do these things." And I was like, standing there, 8, 9, 10 years old, just being like, "I don't need help carrying like 2 chairs. What the heck?" And so, but then there's that internal conflict when you're a kid because you want to do what you're told to do. I was a pretty good kid, and so I was just, I knew one thing in my own body and I was told something else by the rest of the culture. And then my grandmother was a very capable and strong woman herself. She chopped her own wood, she built stone walls. So my example was also that like there was no limitations really, except whatever you figured out were your limitations for yourself, not someone else telling you what those limitations are. And so I carried that with me really throughout my whole life. There was a number of times as I grew older that I was frustrated in various different ways by people telling me that they wouldn't expect that I could do something that I knew I was able to do. And it came from this experience as a child. I knew my body. I think in my 20s, that sort of it went to the back of my mind. I was working on my career. I was doing a lot of other things, but it would return every so often. And that's, I think, was why I started sort of collecting this information, was because I had this sort of thing that sat on my shoulders in a certain way since I was a kid that just really pissed me off.
Yeah, for sure. I hate to broaden it because I'll broaden it just to bring it back, but like it's not just about physical limitations or lack thereof, is it? Like the messaging that we've received, especially as women from the time that we're very young, really has. I mean, I always talk about the patriarchy like it's the water we swim in. And so those of us who are constrained by it see it all the fucking time. It's right in front of us. But many people who, have the whatever you want to call it, privilege or, whatever, experience where they're not constrained by it. They don't even see the water that they're swimming in. But it's not just these physical quote unquote constraints, is it? Like from the time that we were born, we've been told that there are things that we can't do either because we're not capable or because it's not proper or because it's just not our place or our station. It's so much bigger than just you're not strong enough.
I mean, I agree. I think that it is also, I think this is foundational to it though. I mean, this is my perspective. It's funny, we're living in this sort of disembodied time where we're, on social media and we're floating on the internet and we're, using AI and all of these things. But we're also embodied human beings and we always will be, at least for the near future. And our bodies are actually really important and do inform so much of how we think about ourselves. And I think, we see that we're still wrestling with, and this happens to men too, but I think it's much more impactful for women that, so many of our insecurities, our desires, our freakouts, our all of the stuff that makes us who we are is filtered through our bodies and how they look and how they're perceived and how we feel in them and all of those things. And there's such a huge conversation about that right now. So it's like I'm like sitting there on TikTok and I'm just seeing this ongoing conversation about people saying we should, this is what body neutrality is. This is body positivity, Ozempic, like just the, we should be doing this. We shouldn't be doing this. We should be building muscle. This is what strength is. Skinny talk, like all of this is so still very intense. You would think that, maybe this would calm down or become less important as we are online and living so much of our lives away from the physical realm. But I think it's the opposite. And I think it's because inherently our bodies inform so much of how we feel and who we are. And so if we feel empowered and strong in our bodies, we're then able to speak up. We're able to go out into the world and make those changes that we think are important. And so those things are actually radically connected.
I love that. That feels like such an important insight. And especially, I think it speaks to this kind of central thesis here. I can't help but be reminded of when I read Angela Saini's The Patriarch and like sort of the arguments, the scholastic or the scholarly arguments about sort of the origins of the patriarchy and how I think we have some pretty good understandings now based on records that patriarchy and capitalism sort of raised hand in hand. Like the minute we needed to be able to trade, goods and services for something of quote monetary value, we had to start taking records and property and lineage and all of these different things. Like that's how we started to develop these strong structures. That said, I feel like when I talk to people who haven't sort of been digging deep and haven't been so curious about these questions, I constantly bump up against a fundamentalist or an essentialist argument that, all of this just happened because men are physically stronger and can overpower women. So when it comes down to it, the only reason the structures that we have now are because, push comes to shove, hand-to-hand combat, a man is always going to win. Therefore, women have always been forced into subservience. And I'm like, I don't know, that just seems too simple an argument. And it doesn't seem true.
I think that actually this very wide sort of distinction and this power dynamic differential is extremely modern. And so the next book project that I'm working on is actually going to look at some of this
Oh, I
and
love that.
the anthropology, because honestly, if you look up until the 13 and 1400s, there were certainly power structures set up, but women had a lot more, even in up to that recent history, a lot more power within their communities. And then prior to that, we see all kinds of various examples. Now, of course, there were societies where they were much more male-led. There were other ones that were egalitarian and everything in between. And there was a lot more variety in terms of the way cultures behaved when it came to gender or sex, however, if you want to divide it up. For them, it would have been gender because biological sex wouldn't have been as understood the way we do understand it now. So I think that this is actually a byproduct of capitalism and also sort of the patriarchal systems, having hierarchies is all connected. And I think it's actually modern. I think, people do use these essentialist arguments. And this is why, as I wrote this book, I was like, I really want to go back and answer some of those essentialist arguments, because actually all of the research I did for this made me understand how little of that was actually consistently true over human history. If you look at sort of a longer view, not just the past, few hundred years, basically. So I think you're entirely correct. And that's where these cultural stories come in that are so powerful. So, a really, and this comes into our science as well. And a really good example of that is I write about that there's, this long-standing story about how sperm finds the egg and fertilizes it. I grew up with this story. Everyone I speak to pretty much understands that this is how babies are made. And this is just an incorrect story, and we've known it's incorrect. Basically, the scientists have known it's the egg is actually chooses the sperm since the late 80s, and then certainly into the 90s, this was well known. So if you speak to a reproductive health scientist, they all are going to know this. But if you talk to anyone in the general public, they're not. They're going to think they're going to remember this old story. And so this has been debunked and written about and retaught over this many decades, and we're still kind of like attached to that story because it fits with so many other cultural narratives. And that's how these kind of stories get embedded into our science and into how our scientists even perceive their own work. And I think that's actually one of the more important things when we're talking about science and science education, to think about where are those cultural stories coming. And this is huge in anthropology as well, with this, and there's a lot of revisions going on in that field. But it's really important to think about how these structures interact with each other. And so that's part of what I explore here. But mostly it's really about teasing apart, okay, here's the actual science and here's the stories we've told about that science.
Yeah, and that's so important. I'm curious, when you do kind of a typical shorter form interview with somebody, what are some of the things that you like, the draw them in stories or the realizations as you were doing your research for this book that help people understand, I guess, the importance? Like, what are some of the myths or the misunderstandings that you try to clarify with people right off the top about this long-standing, I don't know, belief that just like men are fundamentally stronger and women are weak and therefore can't do?
I think what I usually start with is my thesis, which is, men have defined what strength means by what their bodies do a little bit better, right? So, and in general, and I always, caveat this, there's a lot of overlap, first of all, between male and female bodies and what they can do. So that's really important to keep in mind. But in general, you can say men have a little bit more explosive power in their muscles. They tend to use carbs over fats, which gives them that really quick energy. So, like sprinting a short distance or lifting something heavy over their heads a few times, or chucking a rock or something else a short distance, great. So, and that's useful. That's great. Those are wonderful and important skills. But those are not the only kinds of strength that exist in human bodies. We have defined what strength means by those things, and we have left out how female bodies are strong in other ways, and sometimes overlapping ways. And that is really, to me, it's an erasure. And so, and it's just unfair. So my argument is not that men aren't strong in general, in these particular ways. It's that, like, women are also strong in a whole bunch of actually amazing ways. And if we talked about female bodies the way we do about male bodies, we would have heard about all these things and be really excited and proud of them. But we don't, because we haven't been formatting the discussion to include everyone.
I wish there was a name for this specific process, because I'm having the thing that happens to me sometimes when I'm recording the podcast, where I find these connections in my brain that are like deep in there, and I'm like, I have to tell you about this thing that relates to, that's so meaningful to me. And it may not mean anything to anybody else, and I don't want to take too much time with it. But one of the things that I often write about and talk about in my weird academic corner, which is clinical psychology, and especially existentially oriented clinical psychology, is the fact
wow,
that
okay.
yeah, it's like very, very obscure, but like the fact that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is sort of the gold standard, it's what is mostly taught in schools now, it's what most people are going to come across, and it's basically all that insurers are going to reimburse. The reason that CBT has become like the thing and has the place that it has, I believe, is because it's by definition easier to test. Like, we developed a scientific approach to doing psychology research based on medical work with like drugs and different therapies where you can do a double-blind, randomized controlled placebo study. It's really hard to do a lot of what we do in therapy that way because there's just too many variables and people are too multifaceted, and it's hard to take out all the variables, right? Therapy is not like, here, take this drug and then come back and we'll see if it worked, and I'll give you a sugar pill and see if that didn't work. And so that's how we test CBT. But one of the types of therapy that I practice, which is existential in nature, it utilizes CBT principles, but it's like CBT plus. And a lot of people argue that there's not a lot of good evidence to support it, that it's heavily anecdotal. And it's because by definition, it doesn't fit the format of the testing structure that was created that I think is misused when it comes to therapy. And I just see this deep parallel here. Like, if it's men who defined what it means to be strong based on their own gaze, right? Based on what they see when they look in the mirror. And then they turn to women and go, look, you're not strong the way that we set the standard for strength. Therefore, you are weak based on our definition. It's always going to be, I don't know, it's always going to be biased. It's like when we discovered that a lot of animals pass the mirror test if we use a different version of the mirror test that's adapted to their senses.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like, there's so many
Yep.
versions of this throughout our understanding. I almost wish there was a name for like the paradigm shift that occurs when you realize the thing that is doing the gaze can't be the thing that sets the standard for comparison, because it will always be biased and centralized to the author.
I bet there is a legal term for that, because I
Probably,
feel like
yeah.
that is something that must come up in the legal world. My partner's a lawyer, so I'm going to have to ask him.
Oh, love that. Okay,
Because
perfect.
I do, because I feel like, yeah, it's like you have to recuse yourself or something somehow.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
it's an inherent bias that, like, even if you work really hard to be unbiased, you can't get past your own gaze. You just can't. Because like, it's why there's a word, anthropocentrism. I guess it's androcentrism. It's just the idea that, like, if we are at the center of everything, we can't not see it from our perspective. And men for so long have set those types of standards because they were the holders of the political power. They were the holders of the medical journals. They were the ones authoring the script. And so everything is going to be centralized to that gaze. And it's no wonder when we started to learn more about women's bodies is when women started being able to do research.
oh yeah, I mean, I would say 80% plus of the experts I talked to for this book were women, and I think that's actually incredibly important, because they're going to fundamentally see things differently. Caroline Gargett, who discovered that there's stem cells in menstrual blood, was one of the first people to even look at the substance, because men were frankly grossed out by it. Were there a few male scientists who were looking at menstrual blood in various different ways? Of course, yes. Who were like, got over the icky factor or whatever, but not a preponderance of men. And Caroline, when I talked to her, was like, yeah, there's other gross things that we study all the time. We study poop, we study pee, we study pus and mucus, all that stuff is like, bodily fluids are really important in research for a whole variety of things, for testing for viruses, viral loads, immune cells, et cetera, right? But menstrual blood had been really ignored. And this is where it's actually really important, even if there's guys out there who are like, don't care about women at all, this ends up hurting them, because at the end of the day, what we learn about we're able to harvest stem cells from something that half the population produces half their life really easily, instead of going into bones and taking bone marrow, stem cells from bone marrow and other very difficult to access places. All of a sudden, we have this really easy supply of stem cells that enables scientists to come up with therapies that benefit everyone, right? And so that is why it's so incredibly important to include all bodies in doing both research and also thinking about how to solve problems, health problems, and other problems that have to do with science, because you're literally just missing half the story when you don't. And it's like putting blinders on yourself And so I always think about what have we missed out in the last 100 years by ignoring women's bodies to the extent that we have, that hurts everyone.
Absolutely. And I mean, we're finding things out literally every day. I would say that when I look at my feed reader for science news, if I specifically focus on biomedical science, one of the areas where there's just rapid discovery is like, hey, we never thought to look at this. And now we know that this happens in a woman's body. I mean, you see articles every day about this kind of a thing.
Yeah, I know. I've been so worried. I'm like, this book is going to be out of date because there's so much happening.
But that's a good thing. That's a good thing. that shows that it's part of the scientific machine and in the way that it's, was always meant to be. I can't help but feel like this book is really, I don't know, salient for me right now because of a lot of, I'm going to make this really personal, but like I'm 41, I'll be 42 this year. 3 years ago, I had early stage cervical cancer, had to get a hysterectomy. I'm now working with these like test strips to try to figure out, like, do I have a period? I don't know. How do I know? Like, where am I in my, journey of like cycles and quote fertility when you don't have any external way to understand that? And then on top of that, I've been doing, I went back and started doing a lot of like adult gymnastics, and I went way too hard, way too fast. So now I'm dealing with like some injuries, right? An ankle injury, a knee injury, just learning my body again, understanding what overuse looks like. And I'm doing a lot of PT, and I've been working with some sports medicine doctors. And it's just been really fascinating learning about my own body in this new way that I never did before. And the difference when I went to see an orthopedist who was male and a sports medicine physician who was female, the difference between how they approached my body, how they talked about my body, the types of tests that they ordered, just the way that they spoke to me. And I'm a medical professional, right? I'm a psychologist who works in a hospital. And yet I felt very small when I was working with this one male physician in particular. And I felt very empowered when I was working with a female physician. And I was like, yeah, if I feel this way and I know the system and I know how to talk to these people, I cannot imagine I mean, I can because I'm a psychologist and I talk to people who go through this all the time as a health psychologist. But the way that women who walk in the door without prior knowledge and without a lot of expertise in how to navigate the system, it can just be crushing. Crushing.
Yeah, that comes up a ton. Of course, I'm sure you've seen a lot of this as well with, pain and pain control, and just how like female pain has been so ignored and downplayed. On one hand, we're told that we're weak. On the other hand, we're given fewer pain medications or protocols, even when, you go through pretty major surgery like a C-section, versus men going through minor surgeries, and all of that. I think is that there's a lot of, even if there is a female practitioner, she may be basing her knowledge and she will have had her training based on male bodies and all the testing that's been done on them and the previous science. So, oh yes, this is what we do for a C-section or an IUD emplacement, and this is what we do for a vasectomy and or surgery on a male body, and those are going to be very different, and that's the training they've received, and that individual then has to unpack that on their own in a way, right? So that individual doctor then has to look at the patients in front of them and maybe make different decisions or try to get some of those protocols changed, which are changing right now. I know the UK Health Service now has very different recommendations for IUD emplacement than they did a couple of years ago. And that's something I covered because there weren't female doctors advocating for it. And also female patients now feel that they can speak up in ways that they couldn't before. And I think, this is where social media can actually be a positive in the world. I think when a lot of women logged on and saw these conversations about female pain for even these very simple, basic procedures being talked about, they were like, oh, I'm not the only one. There's
Yeah,
all
yeah.
these other people who have experienced this. I'm now feel more comfortable speaking up. And so all of those things kind of had to happen at the same time. I mean, there's a couple places in the book where I just detail these incredibly disturbing stories of like many women experiencing health issues and were just not believed or listened to. And, some other great authors have covered some of these situations as well, but it's really important to understand that history behind how this pain has been ignored. So it's like we're tougher and we're able to withstand pain better. And a lot of, people understand that to be a given about female bodies. But from what I've discovered, it's probably just because we have more practice.
Yeah, it's just because we have to be.
Yeah. And anyone who has more practice with pain gets better at handling it. So, like athletes are really good at dealing with pain, and non-athletes are less good. And it's just a practice thing, right? And so women have more pain experience and less treatment for pain. And so we're better at dealing with it. But I mean, whether that's a core physiological function or not is kind of up for debate. It's probably just that we know it more intimately and we have more experience, which is a little heartbreaking. I mean, it's a
Yeah, but
great power, but it's also a heartbreaking one.
of course it is. And it doesn't surprise me personally because I feel like I see all the time, again, going back to that idea that there are these essentialist arguments that women this and men this. But then when you strip away all of the societal influence, all of the like shaping behaviors, it's very, very hard to get down to pure nature. There are some examples where we can do that in a laboratory type setting. But for the most part, once you strip away all of the variables that are socialization variables, it really starts to break down these essentialist arguments in a fundamental way. I think similarly, like you're talking about pain or pain management or pain thresholds, there's sort of the social joke of like the man flu or like, how much our partners or our friends who are male have, become just like these huge babies whenever they're really sick. And for some reason, women don't respond that way when they get ill. Well, it's because they never were afforded the chance to respond that way. They still had to take care of their kids. They still had to run the house. They still had to just get up and go. And so, yeah, of course, you're going to learn how to minimize and sublimate and just push past it. That's not healthy, but it's what society has expected and required us to do for like hundreds of years.
Yeah, I mean, most kids would grow up in a household, and I hopefully this is changing now, but they're seeing their moms sick and doing all the usual things that their moms do anyway, and they see their dads. I mean, just the example of that in and of itself is, I think, really impactful, and kids are learning from what they see, right? And so, does mom get to spend 2 days in bed? When she's sick? Probably not. I mean, I'm not a parent myself, but this is what my friend, and I see my friends doing when they're ill. I'm like, oh, I thought you were sick. They're like, oh, I got to do this, I got to do that, and blah blah blah. And I'm like, I thought, didn't you say you had a cold or what? And they're like, yeah, but
Yeah, if I don't do it, it's not going to get done, right? Whereas the kind of the partners in bed being kind of waited on and taken care of. It's the I mean, that's why we have silly terms like man flu. It's not that they're actually sicker. Like, come on. But people believe that, right? Because it's like, oh, but look at the behaviors. Women probably aren't as sick. They probably don't feel as bad. Look, they're still getting up and doing stuff. And it's like, oh my God. It's such a disappointing, I guess, normativity. And it's so hard to sort of peel the curtain back and show that everything comes back to these gazes. It comes back to this kind of patriarchal structure. And I think your book does such a good job of bringing it back over and over about the fact that like this is what we know, this is what we're learning. How much of this is essentialist? Almost none of it.
it's incredibly difficult to tease apart. And going back to my own childhood experience, I had this really physically empowering set of chores that I had to do, right? And so I grew up to be a person who is like, enjoying doing weightlifting and all kinds of, maybe challenging activities with my body, even though never played a team sport, right? And I feel very comfortable trying new things as well, right? But that is literally how my body was trained. And we think about, our individual experiences, and then you think about the larger experience. And Sophia Nymphius, an exercise physiologist that I interviewed extensively in Australia, has really been challenging the idea that there are some of these bigger differences between male and female bodies, only because it's very difficult to test that in an adult person because of all of the history that each of us has had growing up, right? So I had my experience, which was unusual, and it gave me my perspective that led me to question so many things and write this book. But most young girls are sort of steered towards, even if they are in active families and doing sporty activities, which is wonderful, of course, but they're going to be steered towards doing things that don't really grow muscle. So even little girls are pushed in that direction, and little boys are pushed towards kicking and throwing and activities that build muscle. Girls are doing things that require precision and balance and more careful use of the body, not brute use of the body, right? So and what we do know about child and teenage development is those activities that you do when you're really young actually inform what you are capable of when you are older, especially when you're going through puberty. So fascinatingly, most soccer camps, and this is a very particular look, but it's a good example. Most soccer camps, which is where all the kids who then go on to become soccer stars later generally start. This is like the earliest time when you're pretty good at this thing, you're going to go to one of these sort of elite camps. And the girls, it starts at age 12 or 13. Usually it's 13. Girls are already well into puberty. Boys are just starting. And so there's about a year and a half difference between the onset of puberty. Of course, again, this totally varies by individual person. I'm talking
Right.
about general trends, but the girls are missing out on that, doing that specific activity that then leads to these incredible soccer abilities. So again, this is a very specific example, but Nymphius was basically suggesting we need to start these camps and do these types of sports trainings for many sports earlier for girls, because they start puberty earlier, and you want to get that muscle memory, that bone growth, and all of those hormones and hormonal influences happening at the same time that training is happening. And right now, girls are just at a disadvantage because there's this age thing going on,
Yeah,
right?
that makes
So
sense.
and
Yeah.
that's just like one very
Yeah, one
minor,
of a million. Like, I
tiny
mean,
example. But
look at
yeah,
look at gymnastics. Look at men's gymnastics versus women's gymnastics, and what apparatus they use, what kinds of skills they focus on. And look at the times throughout human history where women could do a trick that was, aggressive and dangerous and required a lot of muscle mass, and then it was like banned for being too dangerous.
oh
Like
yeah. I mean,
there's so many examples of that in gymnastics.
there's been a lot of just keeping young female and older female bodies out of certain activities altogether when they came close to or even eclipsed male performance. So that's a whole other thing. But yeah, I mean, so you put all of these things together. Your kids are getting these messages, right? The psychology, but they're also getting literally physically encouraged or discouraged to do certain things. Girls who do want to do the thing are excluded. If they
Yeah.
do want to do the non-typical female activity, again, that is changing. I write there's a whole section in here about the rise of high school wrestling, which is super
Yeah.
fascinating. Apparently, high school girls they love to wrestle, and it's a booming and growing sport, of one that literally didn't exist even 15 years ago. And so, the proof is in the pudding that you give girls the opportunity, or they create opportunity for themselves, which is what really happened in wrestling. And it can take off. And then they are building these muscles and developing these skills in these areas that were thought as areas of more weakness for women and girls. And the whole paradigm shifts. So
Yeah, but
I think that's actually what's going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years, because I think, you give a little bit of space, and I think the kids and the girls are going to rush in and try new things and experiment and push those boundaries. And we're going to see now young girls who have grown up doing some of this stuff and are then able to really challenge, and aren't sort of hamstrung by the fact that they didn't start lifting weights until they were, 18 years old or 20 years old, and they were already in the sport for years.
absolutely. But it's a generational change, right? Like, I think that what you're describing now, we're seeing with sort of like Gen Alpha and some of these like younger kids. Whereas, as an elder millennial myself, if I were to look around my experience in school and my experience now as an older adult, like, not only did you, like you mentioned, not see the encouragement and the empowerment with young women to, and that's not to say that there weren't women's sports and that there weren't women doing really badass things, but I can attest to the fact that in gym class, and I was athletic in high school, but in gym class, if something hurt or it felt hard, a girl would be told, I know, it's okay, you don't have to push so hard, or don't worry, you could try this other thing instead, or here's how you can modify it. And a boy would be told, suck it up, be a man, don't be a girl, push through it. And of course, when you're obviously, encouraging people in that way, in this deeply sexist, deeply gendered way, what do you think the outcome is going to be?
Yeah. It's
How are they going to, act differently, and what does that lead to in adulthood?
I feel like it's incredible that we've gotten as far as we have after sort of going through, like, we don't have the sports science. The girls are discouraged. They're literally kicked out of programs. They had to like fight to, do many of these activities that we consider normal today that, we had to fight for just a couple decades ago. Like, all of the things, you stack those up. And then, we're talking about Western culture here. You talk about cultures that are in poorer countries, and girls are still doing huge amounts of labor at home. They're doing childcare. They're helping their parents out in ways where boys are out in the street, playing sports. Girls are at home. And so you have a divide in poorer places too, of just plain old opportunity. So, and that's where a lot of amazing Olympic and even, team sports athletes are coming from. They're not all coming from Western countries. So you think about that disparity on top of all these others, and it's just, it's an incredible burden for female bodies.
Absolutely. That's such an important point, because I do think, just like we've been talking about sort of the male gaze, we often do have this sort of Western gaze as well. I'm curious, because we've almost been going a whole hour, which is such a bummer because there's so much more to cover. But I don't even know how to ask this. As we're sort of closing out our hour together, are there huge gaps that I've overlooked, like in your thesis, in your examples? Is there anything that we didn't cover that you're like, oh my God, we have to talk about this?
I think that the one other thing I would mention that's just super fascinating, and I spent a lot of time on, is immunity. So this book, as we've talked about, covers a lot of sort of sports science and details about muscle and reproductive health and pain and some of that stuff. But longevity and immunity are just incredible powerhouses of the female form and body that are so exciting, and something that I just feel like has so not been recognized. Female immunity is all the way down to the neutrophils, and our B cells have better memories, and our capacity to fight off, all types of pathogens, viruses, bacteria, fungus, is incredible. And the details behind it and why that is goes into both XX sort of genetic strengths, having more choices of different immune cells from our genes and being able to turn those on and off. We now realize there used to be this idea that there was X inactivation, and so you're only ever using one of two copies of an immune cell. Well, now we understand that actually the female body is able to turn on other immune cells when necessary, which is sort of a recent discovery. And I mean, this is amazing, incredible stuff. Again, we're going to learn a lot more about what the strengths are of immunity and in the female body as we study the female body more. Most of these tests around vaccines, around all kinds of diseases have been done on men. So we're going to learn important information. And I just think it's so worth celebrating that, like, we have this incredible cellular base power. And I just love it. And I always want to bring it up because it's not as maybe sexy as some of the other conversation topics in the book, but I just find it so fascinating and empowering to know that we have over millennia developed this, and this goes across all female animal and mammals, right? And even insects. So this is like a very deep and core female strength. And so I think just, shout out to our immune systems.
So cool. I love that so much. Well, gosh, there's so much more in the book, you guys. We only barely scratched the surface. I am so grateful for you for putting in the effort, doing all of this really important reporting and sharing these, not just these stories, but these insights with us, and also for taking the time today to join us on the show. And again, just scratch the surface. So thanks so much for being here, Starre.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Kara.
Everybody, the book is The Stronger Sex, What Science Tells Us About the Power of the Female Body by Starre Vartan. And everybody, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.